leaders who don't walk the talk, you can have the best vision, the most beautiful words, the best website, the most clearly defined behaviors. But if you're not walking that talk, people know it and they don't believe you and they will walk away.
Your work doesn't have to be your life's calling for your job to feel worthwhile. You can have moments of meaning in every job, every day, especially if we have the guidance of a great leader.
Organizations, companies, cultures today, those are defined by values. When we can converse and describe what our values are, and when we're devoid of that because we want to try to be everything to everyone, it's really hard to be meaningful in our work. Welcome to the Tyler Dickerhoof Show with me, your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. On today's episode, I am so blessed to be joined by Wes Adams and Tamara Myles. They are both authors of the new book, The Meaningful Work. Excited to be talking about this. Both of you have a background in consulting and leadership and going through UPenn, and each of you have your own perspective. And I love how you shared it in the book. And I can't wait to have you kind of describe more to myself and the audience, one, the impetus of meaningful work, but also kind of having a conversation about where we sit today, 2025. In the advent of this great evolution in the workplace, and why meaningful work is really the path forward.
Thanks so much for having us. We're excited for this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
So as classic, we had a little bit of a good conversation getting started, getting to know each other, sharing and asking questions. And one thing I want to just jump right into and off with is we find ourselves in a polarized world. And there's the work that you guys have done and others have done that really kind of point to this idea. It's like, hey, people want to be valued. They want to work for a company that values them, that provides values to others. But why doesn't that happen?
Well, we could talk about this for the whole time of the
I don't have to ask any more questions. I just get to sit back and listen.
Yeah. And well, I'll start by kind of double clicking on what you said about, 2025, it's a polarized world. And we've been doing this research for 5 years. And in these 5 years, the world and the world of work has changed so many times, from COVID hitting and the pandemic and us all going to work from home and figuring that out, to quiet quitting and the great resignation, to this push and pull between remote and hybrid and back to the office, and now the political scenario we're in. And so we've just kind of been facing disruption after disruption, and that will likely continue, right? It's just the nature of our world and of work. And during all of this disruption, the call for meaningful work continues to grow louder and louder, right? As we have so many different generations in the workplace, and people are questioning, how do I navigate all this? Like, what really matters in life right now? Like, every time you open your phone and you look on social media or you check the news, it's a little disheartening. And meaning can really be our anchor through all of this disruption. It can be the one thing that we can count on. And when we say meaningful work, we're talking about 3 things. It's a sense of community. You talked about, being valued, and that's like being valued for who we are. We can show up authentically, share our full ideas, share our full selves, and feel like we belong and that we matter. And then contribution is the sense that we add value, that we make a difference, and that we know how we are contributing to something bigger than ourselves. And challenge is that, our growth and development are valued, that people want us to learn, to grow, and to be pushed. And so I agree with you. This idea of being valued, feeling valued, adding value is so important right now.
Wes, what do you give me your thoughts? I mean, you guys wrote this together.
I'm always so impressed with my partner, Tamara, because she's so articulate. So I could just sit back and listen to you the whole time. But I wholeheartedly agree with all of those things. And I would say, along the lines of, your opening question, I think work is one of the last places where people with different ideas, different backgrounds, different perspectives still come together and collaborate and cooperate and work together towards shared goals. And I think that if we can find meaning there, if we can find these three C's, community, contribution, and challenge, that can go a long way to helping us bridge some of these divides to, address some of that polarization that you were talking about. And so that's something that I think both of us are really passionate about, and one of the big reasons that we're in this work. And I would say that this idea of, meaning at work is not restricted to people that are working at nonprofits or people that are working in healthcare. That's usually one of the first questions that we get, right? Your work doesn't have to be your life's calling for your job to feel worthwhile, right? You can have moments of meaning in every job, every day, especially if we have the guidance of a great leader. And that's why we wrote this book, was to hopefully provide a playbook for leaders. And by leaders, we mean anyone with influence at a company, not necessarily only people managers, a playbook for them to create more meaning for themselves, but also for other people in the organization, because that gets us all of the things that we want: well-being, job satisfaction, but also performance, productivity, innovation, collaboration, revenue. They're all outcomes of the belief that our work matters.
So do you guys believe in, as you were saying, Tamara, the kind of what's changed in the last 5 years, which might be one of the greatest work revolutions that we in the extent, I would say, history of the United States, when we look at 250, 300 years, probably the most change dramatically to work in the human sense that we've probably could study in such a short time. Do you guys think that maybe that's why organizations are struggling so much with adopting this idea of being attentive to the needs of workers, whatever generation it is, to see and feel meaning in their work?
We didn't even talk about the generative AI changes that are happening even
Yeah,
faster,
throw that
right?
in there.
So let's throw that in there. I think that it's a couple of things. The misconceptions around meaningful work. Wes addressed, this idea that, people think meaningful work is reserved for people in helping professions and all of that. And people also misunderstand how to provide meaning at work until our research. There hadn't been a study that looked at specifically the role of leaders and what are the specific practices, that enable meaning at work. So there was a lack there for sure, and we're hoping to fill that void. So I think that's part of the reason. And then I also think that the other part of the reason is because we're usually so reactive in times of disruption, right? It's hard to take a step back. There's a great parable. I learned it in the book Upstream by Dan Heath, but it's a
great book.
Yeah,
Loved
great
it.
book, right? So the parable of saving the kids, and maybe I'll tell for the listeners who haven't read the book, but if you imagine that you are picnicking by a river on a beautiful spring warm day, not like the weather we're having in Boston this spring, but a beautiful sunny warm day. And you're picnicking with a friend, and all of a sudden you hear a child splashing in the water and kind of screaming for help. And without thinking, you and your friend jump in, right? And you go and you save the child and you swim back to shore. And right when you're catching your breath, you hear another child and you both jump in again, and then another, and you're just saving all these children from drowning. And your friend gets out and starts running up the riverbank, and you're distraught and you're like, what the hell? Like, I need help. Why are you not helping? And your friend says, I'm going to go upstream to see like who's throwing these children in the river to start with. And that is such a great parable to illustrate the power of meaningful work, right? As leaders in times of disruption and change, we are saving the children in the river. We are dealing with disengagement, with turnover, with well-being, and all these other metrics, performance, productivity. Those are really important, but it's much more helpful to run upstream, make work meaningful, and stop the kids from drowning to start with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just happened to think about that the other day. And as I was reading your book, it made me think, I think that's one of the great opportunities in our society where we see, homelessness as a challenge. It's like, what are we doing to get upstream? Right? Instead of just dealing with the current problem, it could be the same as you guys talked about. And as I hear my Rottweiler snoring in the background with Mr. Mondo in your book, and that's just a tip to one of the characters you described in your book, is are we willing to go to, instead of looking and addressing the wound and just throwing a Band-Aid on it, right? Kids, I get it myself. Why don't we go to what's causing that? And I believe that's where I gathered from your work what you shared in the 3 C's, the community, the contribution, and the challenge. Hey, let's go there. What are we doing to build a community first and foremost? The values. What are we here to do? What's important? And one of my beliefs, and I think this is very much upstream, is organizations, companies, cultures today. Right? And when I say cultures, I mean societally, whether that's sports, whether that is, those are defined by values. And when we can converse and describe what our values are, people can say, I'm for that, I'm not. And when we're devoid of that because we want to try to be everything to everyone, it's really hard to be meaningful in our work because we're not differentiating what we're doing to provide meaning. Is that fair? Do you relate with that, either of you?
Yeah, I think this is something that we call alignment, and it's really the foundation of meaning at work, right? This idea that we're able to clearly articulate our values and not just what are the words on the wall, like, oh, I believe in integrity and I believe in teamwork and all of that stuff. But what does that actually mean in our organization? What are the behaviors, the actions that are aligned with those values? And so can you clearly tell that story? And once you do, are leaders in the organization actually walking their talk? Are they actually doing those things? And that is a critical foundation for meaningful work. And we found that it doesn't add a lot of value, but it's the quickest way to destroy meaningful work is to not walk your talk, to not act in line with your values. And so it's really a necessary but not sufficient part of meaningful work. And so that's really foundational. And we interviewed a couple of leaders at organizations who have done this really well, and they've created a system where they have not only defined their values, right, but they have clearly articulated, like Pinterest is a great example of this. They redefined their values a few years ago, and they asked people across the organization, give us an example of what that looks like in action. How does that show up in your day-to-day work? And they, of course, created a Pinterest board of all of these things, right? And so they have this amazing resource that employees can go to. Oh, we believe in integrity, right? What does that mean? Here are 20 examples of how that shows up in the organization. And when you're clear about that, not only is that great for your existing organization, but it also really helps you understand who's aligned, who you want to bring into the organization that's aligned with those values, right? And who maybe, isn't going to be a great fit.
I think that's really a great point of reckoning in so many organizations. Again, in this encapsulated 5-year history, AI, pandemic, remote, whatever that looks like, the financial impact of what's going on in our world. Hey, what are our values? And then allowing for some realignment to say maybe we've evolved as an organization. Maybe we have a new person in a leadership role, and in the values that were once set by someone 7-8 years ago don't fully fit now. And so the more that we can talk about that, and I think a lot of that, I believe the pressure goes on a leader to say, how much am I clearly defining the vision? And if I'm doing that and those values are expressed through that vision, then people are going to say, yeah, this isn't the place for me anymore. And I believe one thing that if you're afraid of doing that, then you're going to have a lot of people that say, I don't even know what my work is for. So you have to be willing to do it to provide meaning to people that are bought in and allow people to say, it's my time to get off the bus. Like, this is my stop.
I mean, I agree. I'll see you and I will raise you even on that because
okay. Let's go.
I think it's not even just enough to set the vision and be clear on what the values are, but it's even more important or equally as important for leaders to then create this culture where people can call you out and call each other out when you're not walking the talk, right? When you're not, I mean, we have an example in the book of a leader, his name is Rob Waldron, and he worked he was the CEO of a company called Curriculum Associates that provides software for elementary schools across the country. Or not just elementary, K through 12 schools across the country, but they are a culture that has well-defined values and the behaviors associated with it. And one time he was telling us a story that he hosted a panel, an event with a few different people, including a woman. But instead of interviewing her and letting her speak, he kind of gave all the attention to somebody else on the stage. But what was amazing is that then somebody called him out on it after and said, you talk about being inclusive, and here you are, you had a woman in finance, at a high level, and you didn't really include her, and you weren't really walking the talk there. And his reaction was amazing. He was like, of course, I'm sure in the moment he felt defensive, but he reflected and he was like, you're right. And then he sent an email to the whole organization apologizing and saying, I should have done better. I did not walk the talk. Right. And that's critical because, like Wes said, leaders who don't walk the talk, you can have the best vision, the most beautiful words, the best website, the most clearly defined behaviors. But if you're not walking that talk, people know it and they don't believe you and they will walk away.
I mentioned this before we hit record. I think that's exactly why, that lack of vulnerable, authentic ownership by leaders is why when I talk to organizations, and I imagine when you talk to organizations, they are struggling to find people that want to go into leadership roles. And, we have documented Gen Z is like, no, not for me, not going to do it. And I believe what you just shared, the lack of that is why. This idea of don't let them see you sweat, just get off stage as quick as you can. They'll forget about it. Whatever you want to describe this, what's happening in leadership. And I think what that's created is a distrust, a lack of alignment because the values, whether they're there or not, aren't aligned or defined. And so people are like, dude, what does it even matter if I show up?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think we sit today.
This came up in our research as well, especially with the Gen Z cohort, right? This is a group that has very high expectations of alignment, right? Very high expectations. And I think feels relatively disappointed with leaders who haven't been walking their talk, right? Who say one thing and do another. And they're also not afraid to talk openly about that, and call people out for that. And I think understandable when you've had a number of role models who haven't lived up to your expectations, right? Why would I want to step into that role if what it means is I have to be one of those people, right? I have to be somebody who's like saying one thing, but actually doing another thing, right? And I think, first of all, that's a shame. I think we, in some areas, could have done a better job of providing strong role models for folks. And I think like a huge opportunity, right? If you're somebody who's in the Gen Z cohort and you're like, why would I want to be a leader? I don't want to do that. Great. Be a different kind of leader. Be a meaning-driven leader, because that's what we need. We need people who are passionate like that to step into those roles. And, we're going to talk in a little bit, I'm sure, about community contribution and challenge, the 3 C's, but put those things into practice. And you don't have to wait until you are a formal people manager to start doing this in your organization and to start seeing the impacts on your colleagues and also on your own sense of, how much your work matters.
I believe when we as a corporate society, right? Organizational leaders, founders, entrepreneurs, we can start to embrace this idea of leadership isn't a title. John Maxwell is one of my mentors and spent time with them this morning. We were talking about expectations and just this idea of when we can find that in place, it doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter if you're taking care of cows. It doesn't matter if you're, doing research work at, Boston College, UPenn. It doesn't matter. When you create that opportunity for people to say, hey, I value you. You don't have to have the same values. You don't have to have the same lifestyle, but I value you and I want you to express that. And if you feel comfortable expressing it here, great. If not, great. And to me, it has to be that definitive in order that we can really have meaning, or then it becomes just, it's placated to too many where it's undefined. Like they say, I don't know. We talked about music. I'm not a music person. Colors, really, that's not my jam either. But, they say, it's not black or white. It's the absence of color that causes the issues. It's like, you can have a color. Great. It's green. It's green out there. I know it's green. It's not blue. It's green. And so by saying that, it's like, okay, that's cool. Great. Awesome. Do you? That's fine. But I believe our society and so many organizations have gotten in trouble or have been challenged to say, well, that's not right. You can't be like that. I'm like, then what am I supposed to be? Because if I can't be myself and I can't, and again, there's allowing people to be who they are, but it again comes back to this. If we are to find meaning, we have to be able to be okay to say, this isn't for me. Okay, that's good. Great. You know what is or isn't. Does that resonate? Have you guys seen that, understand your work and your research? Help me and just kind of go along here.
Well, two things came up for me as you were talking, right? And those came directly from the research. And one is this idea of values being the colors that you were talking about. If we stand for X, Y, and Z values, and you're like, great, awesome, you do you. These are not necessarily my values, so I don't think I want to work there. Or if you're in the company and recruiting people, you're like, oh, okay, well, your values don't quite align. Like maybe you're not the best fit, even though you have the skills, right? So that's one way. But I think another way that we found so strongly in the research is this idea of creating the space, right, to engage the whole person, to let people go beyond their identity that you see, maybe a little bit, if you think of an iceberg, you go below the waterline, right? Because what we see, and when we are judging people's identity, whatever green means for you, right? It's one thing, but the further down the waterline we go, the more that we can see people as whole selves, the more we realize we have so much in common. Most humans have these desires, these drives, these things that are like so much deeper than what you can see on the tip of an iceberg. And it was so enlightening and beautiful in the organizations that we study to see how they kind of engage and embrace the whole person, right? Because when you stop at the surface level, it's really easy to be the other, right? But when you go beneath the waterline, and that's what Wes was saying, like our workplaces are one of the last places where sometimes in some workplaces, right, we have the opportunity to show up fully, to bring our whole selves and to collaborate with people that are so different from us. Yeah. But that's where kind of magic, happens and creativity blossoms, and we bring that home with us too. Like when we can show up in that way and we're recognized and appreciated for who we are and for our full set of ideas, that translates to how we show up in the world with our families, and it just creates these ripple effects.
I think in that very last point is when I think when people feel free to be able to express that at work and at home, there's less internal conflict of who am I really? And I think that shows up when we interact and we lead people, because then it's easier to do so with greater authenticity and understanding, hey, this is my unique value. This is my unique skill set. This is my uniqueness. And when I can embrace that, then your uniqueness doesn't offend me because I'm not trying to figure out who the heck am I and what meaning can I have. That's been a personal thing. Go ahead, Wes. Yeah.
I was just going to say, this is reminding me of work by Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy, who wrote the book An Everyone Culture. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they talk about people basically having a second full-time job of wearing a mask at work, of having to show up as a certain person, and how much, first of all, how much energy that takes away from your ability to focus on your job, because you're always, figuring out, okay, am I going to fit in here? Am I going to do the right thing in this situation? Am I going to offend anybody? But also it deprives people of the full range of ideas and perspectives that are required at this point for us to succeed as an organization. Like we are entering a phase where what worked yesterday is not going to work tomorrow. The way that we've always done things isn't going to help us win in the next 10 years. We need new ideas. We need different perspectives, right? And so we have to create an environment where challenges to our existing ideas and perspectives aren't just accepted, they're required. They're appreciated. And so that requires each of us to like be uncomfortable, in a way that doesn't always feel good.
I think the opportunity is to be challenged, to be uncomfortable, know it's a safe place, know that there's trust, but also understand that if that's not a challenge that you're up for, that's okay too. Because if that comes back to a value, it's just like, that's not for me, then the ability to say, hey, I'm going to go find somewhere else, that needs to be valued, I think, in a culture that meaning is in place.
I would say yes, and
okay,
I would
please.
say like yes, it's good for you to understand whether the culture is a good fit for you or not, and having this ability to interact with people who disagree with you is fundamental in today's society, right? Like we are not going to get very far if we're not able to have an open conversation with somebody who has different ideas from us. And I think we're very far away from that at the moment, right? And
I mean, that's been displayed vividly in our society, which is unfortunately spilled into the workplaces, which I believe has massively challenged this idea of meaning, because we've kind of lost it. Instead of saying, oh, we can have meaning and be completely different in our lifestyles, but actually our values are pretty darn similar, or our backgrounds are completely different. I grew up on a farm. Tamara grew up in Brazil. I mean, it's different, right? But yet we can sit here and say, oh, as different as we are, we have a lot in common, because, okay, that's cool. Let's hinge on that. And then be fascinated about those differences. To me, that's the and, but I mean, please keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned the most personally when I've been hanging out with people who are very different than me, right? I'm like, oh my God, that's a completely different way of seeing things. Like, if I'm like, that's weird, I'm not interested in talking to you, I really lose out in that situation. But if I lean in and I'm like, what's it like to grow up on a farm? Like, tell me more about that. Like, like that is fascinating for me. And I find that also just adds a lot of value to my life personally and helps me expand my perspective so that I can see different ways of doing things that are valuable.
I want to interject just to that point, and maybe people can relate to it. When I was 15, our society did not embrace that. Our society mocked, made fun of, said if you grew up on a farm, you were less than. It was to the point of our society is like, you're worthless unless you leave the farm, go to the city, go get a real job. And we're in a massive reckoning in our society, because now we have popular media that's saying, oh, actually, that's pretty attractive. COVID drove that. It's like, I have friends that lived in New York City, bought a farm upstate New York. They're now raising beef cows, had never been on a farm, never raised cows at all. He was a trainer for the New York Yankees. She was in, journalism. It's like, now they're raising cows because they wanted something different. They're like, oh, we're willing to go do it. And yet what you just asked is like, that's been a very foreign coming to grips with over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. It was hide from it. Don't put that thing up there, because people are going to laugh at you. And that is a real thing. You talk to, producer Alex is listening. I have an assistant of mine. She grew up in Western Iowa. And we were talking one day about this. And she goes, yeah, no, Tyler's not lying. That's what our society has done. And now we're coming to the back end of that, where we can look at other things, sexual alignment, to religious, beliefs, to whatever, racial this or that, and sit and say, oh, well, you don't know what it's like. I know what it was like to live on a farm and get made fun of for how I smelled on the bus. I remember being in grade school, and I was in a rural community. I wasn't in, a very, very, urban area, and still that was happening. And so the ability for you to wonder is kind of off-putting, because for many times in my life, it was, oh, let me ask so I can mock you, make fun of you, because that's what our overall society has done. And that's why we see the trades and farming as a career dying for people, because for an entire generation, we said, get the heck away from that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's such a way to destroy any meaning that you get from that part of your life, right? And from that part of your identity, when it's not okay, when the world is telling you that that's wrong and it's not a way. And I mean, we see that in workplaces, unfortunately, whether it's, how you grew up, or whether it's what you look like, or whether it's what ideas you have about things. At the end of the day, if we're thinking about community building and that strong C of meaningful work, think about being valued for that, right? What is it like in the exemplar organizations that we studied and that we work with, when instead of having that response that you're so used to, people ask, what was it like? And, tell me a story about a time when, and oh my gosh, I'm so sorry you got made fun on the bus. Like, that sucks. And I mean, we all have layers, right, of our lives, that pieces that were undervalued or actually, we were told were wrong, that we tried to hide. I mean, I am an immigrant from Brazil, right? Not a great time to be an immigrant right now, but I do have citizenship. But yeah, and like an accent, and we all have parts of our identity that were undervalued at some point. And when there is space for us to bring those parts of ourselves, if we want to, that can be so meaningful and so different than the usual.
I think as you mentioned that, and I imagine, Wes, you have the similar experiences where it's like, sometimes one of the greatest things a leader can do is spotlight. What you just said, Wes, is like, hey, tell me more about that. Tamara, tell me more about, what life was like in Brazil, like, the challenge of moving, because I imagine it was, if you didn't, weren't embraced in the culture of the US or the language, it was, man. And so I think that an opportunity of someone to say, oh, no, scratch the surface, and, tell me more, is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think just doubling down on that, like the research, not our research, but other research shows that, like, that feeling of exclusion, of being excluded, of being pushed to the side, which I think all of us can relate to at one point or another, like that activates the same receptors in our brain that like are activated when we feel physical pain, right? Like it's a very strong reaction that we all have. And the research also has identified the number of people that we need to be connected to mitigate the feeling of that exclusion, the pain of that exclusion. And that's one. We need one friend at work. We need somebody who is empathetic to us, who connects with us, to mitigate all of those negative impacts of exclusion. And so there's an opportunity for everyone of your listeners to be that one person for someone in their organization, to lean in and to say, oh man, tell me more about that. I would love to learn more about you. It's different than my experience, and I'm curious about that.
I just want to add, because there might be people listening that are, oh, well, I don't know, I'm not really great at this like personal connection, like, oh, tell me your life story thing. But if you think about it from a work perspective, you could think of, all right, tell me like what strengths or what did you learn from growing up on a farm that you use at work every day? What did the experience of being an immigrant teach you that makes you a better writer or better researcher or better teacher? You know what I mean? And so you can even have these connections if you're like, oh, I don't really want to. We talked to a leader today. They're like, oh, I don't really do the whole like feelings thing, but you don't have to. You can even just do it from a strengths perspective. And what do you bring to work? And how is your background part of how you show up here or when I see you at your best?
There's a piece there that I want to know, like being an immigrant. Well, like, how did that inform your research, but also writing this? You pose it. I want to know.
Oh, you actually asking me?
Yeah.
So Brazil, I grew up I'm from a huge family. If you think like my big fat Greek wedding, that is my family, literally. Okay. Everybody's in each other's business. Grew up going to my grandmother's house every Sunday with my 14 first cousins and 6, aunts. And, so it was a beautiful experience. And we're very community driven. It's a very collective kind of society. People are just warm. And that really informs, I think, my perspective at work and like the valuing of relationships and of each other in the US, which tends to be more of an individualistic society, right? And so when we found in our research, when this like the strong sense of community came up as such an important part of meaningful work, I resonated really deeply with that. And it's in my bones and how I grew up that I operate in that way. And so that's definitely a strength, that growing up in Brazil taught me. And then my immigrant experience isn't the traditional immigrant experience you hear about in the news, right? I came as a college student, and I've been here ever since through work visas and then marriage and all of that. But it's still hard, right? You're still leaving a world behind and entering a new world. And you kind of live in this liminal state where you're transitioning in between cultures all the time. And that really, I think, teaches a lot about empathy, about different perspectives, about navigating transitions. And so there's a lot of strengths, I think, in all of our experiences that we can bring forth to work into life.
Wes, what about you? In regard to, and obviously not coming from Brazil, but just your childhood, your growth, your evolution, like how did that impact you in writing this book, but also doing the research?
Yeah, I thank you for asking. I have a very different experience from Tamara. I grew up in Florida in a small town. I went to a small school. I'm gay. I was, very, I think, ashamed of that when I was a kid. It wasn't something that, we talked about. It was something people made fun of. Yeah. I think maybe in a similar way as to growing up on a farm, right? And so that idea of like wearing a mask to fit in and having to show up or show up to fit in and feeling excluded is something I really resonate with. And so when we came across that in the research, I think that it made a lot of sense to me, right? It's also very, like you were talking earlier about sort of the model of work. I also grew up in like a culture of work where it's like, okay, you do your work and you go home and you like leave the other stuff at home, right? Like you don't bring that stuff into work and you come in, you do your job and like you have two different selves, right? And that was the prevailing theory of how you should do things at the time, which we know now, of course, is like a terrible way to get the best work out of people. But there's still that, like we're still like iterating on that culture, right? Or that leadership style. And so I think it was really helpful for me to kind of tap into my own experience to understand that what I learned about being a leader was wrong and I needed to change my mind about that. And I think the more people I've talked to, just in life and work and also, through this research, the more I'm able to say, man, that stuff that I learned growing up, like those ideas weren't right, like they were actually counterproductive. But it's hard to let go of those things. It's hard to unlearn some of that behavior.
I think what you just mentioned there is probably what's made it most challenging for leaders and organizations the last 5 years. It's my personal, because it's been so much, as we identified multiple times here. Man, I just got to go back to something that I knew that worked before, which was actually way less productive, more like, I would say disaligning, more offensive. And it's almost, I'm going to go to this. I had this conversation yesterday and somebody was talking about in their organization, they have, and take this for what it is. I know you guys have framework. It's great. It's a good framework, right? but it's death by framework. All right. So list that out where they're talking about, we're good to great. We're 5 dysfunctions. We're, a strengths. We're like all these things like, dude, we're just over it all. And I think as this is, when we're looking at organizations, like, all right, we're facing the challenges of disengagement. Like we know there's a values break. We have this massive turnover. All right, let's identify, is it that we don't know what our hedgehog is? Do we have like dysfunctions on team? Or are we following what I'm going to call toxic leadership styles that are way too aggressive and not empathetic, not connecting to a point where, oh, that's our problem. All right. Let's use the meaningful work framework because that's actually the tool we need to use right now. Doesn't mean any of those things are bad. There's a time and place for them. But right now, we probably need way more meaningful work frameworks to enter into the workplace rather than, hey, let's go chase our hedgehog.
Can we dive into that for a second? Because I think this is really great.
We got all the time in your world. Yes, please. Because it's very...
And I think this is something that we don't get to talk about as much as I would like to anyway in some of these conversations. But, I think it's important to remember that the model of work that we currently operate on, like the one that all companies who operate today evolved from, is the Ford factory model, right? Which was developed to manage people like they were sort of, on an assembly line to do the exact same thing over and over as perfectly as possible, right? And we continue to iterate on that old model. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have is that model doesn't work for what we need now, right? And so we can continue to try to iterate on a broken model, or we can do the really difficult work of taking a step back and saying, maybe we need a different model. And that's really hard because all of us grew up in the old model or some version of the old model. And, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now, especially with the convergence of all of the things that have happened in the last 5 years that we talked about, is that it's very clear now that the old model doesn't work and that we need leaders who care about us as people. We need to do things that are meaningful to us. We want to be challenged to learn and grow, not do the same thing over and over again like cogs in a wheel. And so, that's a bigger, more philosophical conversation around work, but an important one.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is because you can go back millennia and see where actually that was the way to kind of interact with people. I'm a Christian, but you go to Buddhists, you go to even a lot of Muslim doctrine, you go to a lot of other faiths. Guess what they all center on? Care about people.
Care, compassion.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's pretty revolutionary. It's not a cog. It is, you have a unique purpose. You're here for a time and a place. And you are like, again, it doesn't, I've learned enough from enough people to know they all kind of follow the same. There's differences in practice, whatever maybe. But there's coming back to what you guys said earlier, what Tamara, you said earlier, we're different. But then you start scratching down. It's like there's a lot of common here. So when I hear what you say, Wes, it's like this massive philosophical change. Actually, I think you go back to the Stoics. You go, it's what they found worked in society, and it's like, hey, let's go back to that.
That's basically the science of positive psychology, right? It's scientific evidence for all these principles that either was like grandma's wisdom that had told us or philosophical underpinnings from Stoics and like from Aristotle, right? It's taking these philosophies and studying them scientifically to see, guess what? They work. And now we have scientific evidence that they work. And I think the human need for meaning in life that comes through the work we do, because we spend more time working than doing anything else, right? And so a lot of our sense of meaning comes from the work that we do. And we know that, I'm sure your listeners have read Viktor Frankl's, Men's Search for Meaning, and think about what he was going through when he he didn't write it then, but the book is based on his experiences then. And it's our ability to navigate, like it anchors us during disruption, during adversity. It gives us something to kind of work towards and gives us hope. And I think that's really what we are looking for, at least for sure during the past 5 years of all this disruption, for sure in the future and all the disruption that's going to continue. But also, like you said, for millennia, we are meaning-making machines,
Yeah.
animals, humans.
Wes, Wes, you asked this, and this to me is what you just shared, Tamara, is the 3 C's coming together, right? It's that community that, it's the +1, the one that says, oh, I see you. Oh, all of a sudden now I'm making a contribution because I'm seen. And then the challenge is it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be simple. It's, to your comment earlier, Wes, it's like, this is philosophical. It's like, no, that's the challenge. That's the challenge, is that there's this radical new different way. It's like, no, get away with the mess of everything. I kind of this idea that I share with you guys, the peanut butter and jelly between the 2 slices of bread. Yeah, that's what's happening to everyone that's sitting here saying it needs to be different. We're getting squeezed in the middle. That's a fun challenge. And at the same point, it's realizing that, it's not novel, because as you guys said, it's been documented and it can be repeated. And it's just like, yeah, let's not make this harder than what it is. And I see you and appreciate you. And it's to the point of, how do our best organizations meet? Best organizations are the ones that repeatedly, find meaning and express meaning through their work and their workers. Is there, I see you, I value, these are you guys mentioned Chick-fil-A in the book. Hey, they have a very extreme set of values. Not everyone aligns with it. But you know what? They're continuing to be who they are, and people flock to it, even if they're like, that's not my values. I'll go because I enjoy the experience, or I appreciate it. It's like, maybe I won't want to work there, but man, I can appreciate who they are. And I think that's where this alignment to the 3 C's of the community, contribution, and challenge actually show up where we see it, rather than being so uniquely different. It's just saying, oh no, that's the way.
Absolutely. Mic drop.
Yeah. Also, the waffle fries are really
Dude, they're pretty good. They're pretty good. I mean, it's, as people say, the food isn't great. Like, oh my goodness, it's not a, sitting down at a 3-star Michelin, but you know what you're going to get. They're going to do it with a smile, and they value you no matter what car you drive up in, and whatever music you have playing, you're going to be treated at a standard. It's like, dude, isn't that what we all want?
For sure.
Yeah. As we wrap up, one last question is, where can listeners that are listening and say, I want to find this book, I want to go through the assessment, I want to understand the framework, where can they go to learn more about the both of you, but also this work and the other work that you guys have done?
You can find us on our website, which is www.makeworkmeaningful.com. And there are also a lot of free resources and tools from the book there that you can download, frameworks if you're into that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But also,
there's just a place for it. There is.
Yeah. But also small things that you can do every day, that are easy to do and applicable. And Tamara and I are both on LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can find us there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for your time. I appreciate everything that you shared. And for everyone watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to get notified whenever we drop new content. And one more thing, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening, if you could rate and review this episode, it will allow more listeners to find impactful people like Tamara and Wes. Until next time, choose to lead with impact.